Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dream Lab. This video is a unofficial, or it's my video, official part 2 to the previous video that I posted. Both of these videos are about the webcomic making process. The previous video is about the generalized step-by-step process of making a webcomic from general concept to finished product. I'd recommend watching that video first if you haven't before looking at this one, because I ended up having so much to say for that first video that a lot of things ended up on the cutting room floor, including a whole tip section, which I ended up repurposing for the video that you are watching or listening to right now. So yeah, that's pretty much what we're going to discuss today in this video while you watch a speed paint or two, because I have a lot to yap with the subject. So let's just jump into it with the first tip. My first tip, and this may seem obvious, and I'm not sure how many people need to hear this, but I needed to hear this about 2 years ago, which is, before you even go about making a webcomic, ask yourself if you've made comics before, or anything sort of similar with some sort of consistent project of combining text and words together. The main reason is that, and I think this has been demonstrated through this video, is that comics are a commitment. Even if you're doing things casually and you're not trying to gain an audience, it's just for fun, it's still a lot of work to plan and to write and to execute the comic. And so if you haven't gotten some practice, worked on some smaller related projects first, it would be a bummer to have this story and characters you care about, and to start working on a webcomic only to hit a wall partway through the story and realize this sucks actually, and to quit, because that would stink, because I know you probably have OCs you like and want the story to go through. So solution to this is that if you need to discover or need some practice, just to do some smaller projects, start with 1 or 2 panel studies or projects, and then maybe work your way up to a small short story with at maximum 50 pages. Don't turn this into its whole other thing. That's way too ambitious. And this can double as a fun way to play around with certain concepts, or do a fun side story to your idea that can't be fit into the main narrative. There's ways to make it fun and not like a chore. But once you've done some practice and have figured out, this is fun actually, I like this, I could commit some time in my week or month to plugging away at this, then go ahead and start on the big thing. Second tip is one that you've probably heard for a lot of different types of things, which is to read other webcomics or graphic novels or regular comics, just to see how they go about telling stories visually. What compositions do they use? How do they use color? How do they take advantage of their style? How do they lay out panels? Because it's always a little different from artist to artist, at least a little different. And frequently, one thing I did over the summer is that I went to the library and just went to the graphic novel section and just checked out whatever looked interesting, and just reading that stuff and being like, that composition looks cool, or the way this page is paced is really interesting, and figuring out the science behind it, studying it a little bit, and then you can steal the techniques. A third tip, and I know a lot of you aren't gonna like this, but your work will likely be a lot stronger if you ask people for constructive criticism while you are in the pre-production stage and while you're in the middle of drawing your comic, or just at any point during the comic process actually. Now, this is yet another topic that could be its own video. There's a way to and to not go about getting constructive criticism. I find that it's not helpful to just post something into the void on especially Instagram or TikTok. and just asking for feedback, since a lot of the time you're going to have people who don't really know what they're talking about saying things that are mostly just very discouraging. We'll put it that way. If you have other artist friends, you can ask them for feedback. If you have a professor or a teacher that you can ask, you can do that. If you're friendly with other artist on whatever social media, you can send them a message asking if you want to trade feedback, I suppose. Just any sort of artist you know who you feel like would be able to be honest with you, but also not mean, is someone you want to go for. And if you don't have anyone like that, there are things like Discords that are specific to getting feedback. Hopefully I will do some research and look up some ones that are examples that you might be interested in joining. I think when asking for feedback from people who are artists or do know about some sort of writing or drawing process, it's good to give them a sense of what your intention is for the project, what type of story you're going for, what your goals are, and giving them that context first before showing them the thing. So that way when they critique, it can be less of a guise of, is this good or bad, in a complete vacuum. It's more in a, this is what you're trying to do, how effective is this at achieving that goal? If you need some questions to ask, here's a prompt list that you can give them if they're struggling to figure out how to answer, or you don't know quite what to ask. Another hot take about feedback is that I also think getting feedback from people who know absolutely nothing about that process, in this case the comic making process, or the drawing process, or writing, also show them your stuff. Especially if this is someone who is in the target audience of your work, because not every person who's going to be reading your comic is going to be someone that knows the ins and outs of art or writing or whatever. Like, for example, if you're making something that's for kids, it seems like it would be important to show your work to actual kids, so that way you can see if it's something they actually connect with or if they're interested in. For these, though, the questions are a little bit different. Here's a list. You're probably not going to rely on this group of people to tell you very specific things that work or don't work. It's just more on vibes, I'd say. Next tip, and this one is specifically if you're making a comic less for fun, or you should always make comics for fun, but if your comic does have the intention to have people really engage with it and become fans of it and like it, I'd say for this one it's really important to be consistent with your uploads from the get-go. I should clarify that, again, you do not have to post every single week if that's just not feasible for your schedule, but as long as you're posting every week, every other week, every month, it just more matters that you pick a schedule and you stick to it. I think at the beginning a lot of readers are trying to pick and choose whether they want to commit to trying to check in with your stuff every day, so I think it's especially crucial to be consistent at the very beginning. I guess as a next tip to follow up immediately after that one, if you want to make consistent uploads less scary, I'd suggest making your first handful of chapters ahead of time. Like for me, I made the whole first 4 chapters and then started out just posting the first one, and that made it that I had a 3 chapter buffer for my entire year of college after that, because I figured that there would be at some point during my college year in which I would not have the time to dedicate to doing the webcomic, and it was nice to be able to have that decision, or to have that flexibility, to be able to be like, I've got a buffer, it's not a huge deal if I can't keep up pace this week. And that ended up being really crucial because during the last year of my college career, I was so busy that I had no time, and so I used up my buffer. Admittedly, I could have worked on the comic at least a little bit, even if I couldn't make a full chapter that week, in hindsight, but either way, it was useful. Tip number 6, I believe, which is I'd suggest when doing any part of the webcomic making process to avoid perfectionism, and specifically with planning, do not meticulously plan out everything. The reason why I say that you should not meticulously plan is just that one reality of most webcomics is that they take a long time to finish. The thing about meticulously planning too much about the webcomic in the pre-production phase is that webcomics are things that take years to develop. You're posting them pretty consistently every week or month or whatever. It just takes a lot of time before the story finishes. And I think for a lot of webcomic artists, there's always that risk that you're partway through working on the webcomic, and then suddenly, either through someone in your comment section or just something that you think about in the middle of your making process, that you come up with a different direction for the story to go in that makes more sense and is better. And if you meticulously plan all of that stuff, then it feels like you're obligated, maybe, to go stick with the route you're already on because you spent so much work on it already. I think if we're talking about like a normal book, you should plan as much as possible, but for something like a webcomic that does get released in parts, I think just embrace the flexibility of it. Another note on this topic is just that perfectionism is frequently just another form of procrastination. This is especially true if the webcomic hasn't been posted yet and you're just working on fixing up your first handful of chapters or finalizing your character designs or your story. Oftentimes I think people get really fixated on trying to have the strongest, best first impression that you can ever get, that it ends up being a way to not get the project out there at all. Oftentimes this need comes from a fear of what will happen once you put yourself out there. And so one form that I've seen other people do is that they get really fixated on just fleshing out the world building to such an enormous extent in which a lot of it will never really trace back to the main story. But part of it is that it seems like it's productive to work on world building or designs for all of these little things, but it's often distracting from working towards getting the full project done. And so if you find yourself really lingering in a particular stage, you just gotta move on, I think. Tip number 7, and this is one that is specifically for people who has a style that tends to lean a little bit more highly rendered and detailed, that you're probably gonna have to come up with ways to either use some custom brushes or something to either cut back on some of that detail or to make drawing that sort of stuff quicker, or you're just going to have to simplify your style a bit, because especially when it comes to character design, drawing the same character over and over and over gets to be kind of a chore if their designs are too detailed. Another tip I'd say is that if you make your comic in part to be read and enjoyed by other people, you probably should advertise it a little bit before it comes out. I suggest doing so at least a month before your deadline. A couple benefits to it is that 1, once you post and announce your comic out there, it gives you a deadline to force you to hurry up the process and finish things up instead of dragging your feet and moving the time goalpost farther and farther out. And 2, it allows more people to get their eyeballs on it at the very beginning. The most fun way I've seen people advertise their comic is basically posting OC lore, where they focus on just animating or drawing some fun character interactions or some mysterious lore implications. And those videos can do pretty well on places like Instagram and TikTok. That's what I did. But if there's a more traditional way of marketing that gels with you better, I don't see why you can't do that. But I think that's one of those considerations that I think kind of goes under the radar in the webcomic making process, and so just throwing it out there. So the last 2 tips I got for you are more for when the comic is already getting updates and is out. One thing you might notice if you start posting webcomic updates is that the process can get a little repetitive after a while. This is especially true if you're someone like me and you post once a week. You kind of get into this weekly rhythm where your weekly schedule of webcomic making kind of evens out, smooths out, and becomes kind of the same week after week, which for me personally, the autism side of my brain really likes that. And the ADHD part of my brain sometimes needs a break from that. This is a tip, which is just finding ways to keep the process fun. And so I have, I believe, 5 things to recommend to you in quick succession. Actually, not so quick. I yamp a lot. So, consider organizing your break times either in ways that will give you rewards or just depending on how your body is feeling. And so, if you're feeling tired, you probably should take a break. Does your wrist hurt? Take a break for your health. If you would like to give yourself a little reward or motivator to get a certain task done, take a break. Secondly, one thing that I do is that I use each of my chapters as a way to study and improve on stuff. And so, for example, if my chapter is really focusing on or really relying on expressions to be good, I do little studies of expressions. If the chapter is focused a lot on backgrounds, sometimes I look up photos of similar backgrounds, or I look up, I think they're called grayscale thumbnails or something like that, to figure out where I should place my values. Third thing, and this is probably the most common for a lot of us artists, is to listen to things while you draw. Usually my go-to is for video essays, since I find, especially for movies and TV shows I haven't seen before, I like giving those my full attention, but you can also listen to music, and sometimes, just to switch things up, I don't listen to anything. I also have done you the service of making a playlist of some of my favorite video essays from some creators I really like. So if you're looking for some new content, I got it. Another thing you can do is to squeeze in comic making time with hanging out with other people. And so, if you chat with people online, you can draw while you're doing that. If you're just doing a little casual hangout with friends or family, you can draw while they're doing stuff. Finally, one thing that I think helps with keeping the process fun and to reduce the process from feeling so repetitive and like getting kind of sick of it is that I give myself a day or two in my week, usually the weekends, to just not to do anything webcomic related at all. Our final tip, which is once you've got a good amount of chapters under your belt, to consistently make it a habit to go back and read your old stuff that you've made so far. There's a few reasons why I'm recommending this to you. For one, I actually find some of my earliest chapters still have some of my favorite art and technique, and sometimes there are certain habits that just fall out of habit over time that I would like to rediscover and re-implement for the stuff I work on now. Secondly, you're gonna notice that some of your chapters that you were proud of previously, you now notice so many mistakes with them. You're gonna notice improvement. Part of that is just the nature of webcomics. When you're posting anything consistently for a long amount of time, there's always going to be a decent amount of improvement. And that's something that's inevitable and should just be embraced for what it is. I think if you were trying to obtain a project that was entirely consistent in quality throughout, that's what something like graphic novels are for, I think. Like, I find for my own webcomic that there's a lot of things in previous chapters that I would definitely do differently, but I can't be too hard on myself. This is my first major webcomic project, and that's the fun about webcomics, is that there's always an opportunity to do more and to be better and to always improve with every post that you make. And then with the third thing, it helps you get a sense for how your webcomic's story, composition, and etc. flow when everything is put together. So yeah, that is all of the tips for today. I'm sure that there's some sort of subject or topic that I've thought of before that I might be forgetting here, but I'm cutting myself off here at 10. I hope you found the tips helpful, and I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe if you want, and sleep well. Bye bye!